Imagine an entire city holding its breath. Imagine the silence taking over streets that, days before, teemed with merchants, artisans, and horses. Imagine the smell of burning herbs escaping through the cracks of locked doors, while entire families knelt on the dirt floor, praying that would not cross their threshold. This is not fiction. This happened, and it happened in London in the autumn of 1348. When the largest epidemic ever recorded in human history reached the English capital and transformed every home into a silent battlefield against the invisible. The images you are seeing now have been reconstructed with the aid of artificial intelligence, based on historical records, accounts from medieval chroniclers, and archaeological research to bring to life a past that was almost forgotten. If you enjoy this type of content and want to continue traveling through time with us, leave a like and subscribe to the Reconstruction of the Past channel. The plague arrived in England through the port of Melcombe in the Dorset region around June of that year, brought by sailors from Gascony, an English territory in southwestern France. In southwestern France. The bacteria traveled hidden in the blood of black rats and, above all, in the fleas that lived on these animals. Upon the rats dying, the fleas commenced their search for new hosts. Thus humans became the nearest accessible targets. In a few weeks, the disease spread throughout southwestern England, hitting Bristol with devastating force. Then, following three main routes by land from way off, passing through Salisbury and Winchester by land from Gloucester, and by sea by boat, the pestilence reached London. Some accounts indicate that the first cases in the capital appeared as early as September, on St. Michael's Day. Other chroniclers indicate the beginning of November as the landmark of the arrival of the Great Mortality. What no one disputes is that in the following months, London would be transformed into a scene of horror. To understand what it meant to live inside a London house during that period, it is first necessary to understand what that house was like. London in the 14th century was a city of approximately 70,000 inhabitants, crammed within ancient walls. The streets were narrow, winding, and served as open sewers. Garbage accumulated in the alleys, and the stench was part of the daily landscape. The homes of the poorest, who were the vast majority, consisted of single-story structures made of wattle and daub, with walls of mud interwoven with branches and covered by thatched roofs. The floor was of compacted earth, sometimes covered with straw or rushes to absorb moisture. There was no adequate ventilation, a single door, and at most, a small opening in the wall served as the only source of light and air. Inside these dwellings, the entire family slept, cooked, and lived in a single room. Furniture was scarce. One or two wooden benches, perhaps a chest to store their few belongings, and a straw mattress spread on the floor or on a rudimentary base. The hearth was usually in the center of the room, and the smoke escaped through an opening in the roof. It was under these conditions that rats found the perfect environment. They dug burrows in the earthen floor and climbed the walls to build their nests in the thatched roof high above the heads of the people sleeping below. Infected fleas fell from these nests directly onto the inhabitants, while their families, such as successful merchants and artisans, lived in two-story houses usually, with a narrow facade facing the street and a longer plot of land laid back. The ground floor served as a workshop or shop, and the upper floor as a living space. These houses already had some separation between the rooms, with a main room, a kitchen, and a bedroom. Everyday objects included wooden or ceramic plates, pewter mugs, iron pots, basins for washing hands, tallow candles, and for the wealthier, bronze candlesticks and thick fabric tapestries to cover the cold walls. However, even in these more comfortable residences, The proximity to the contaminated street and the lack of any notion of hygiene, as we know it, made everyone vulnerable. When the plague truly took hold in the city between the end of 1348 and the first months of 1349, life inside the home changed drastically. The first sign that something terribly wrong was approaching was the news that a neighbor had fallen ill. Initial symptoms included high fever, intense sweating, and vomiting. Then, painful swellings appeared in the groin, armpits, or neck called buboes, which quickly darkened, ironed. Most of those infected did not survive more than 3 or 4 days after the appearance of the first signs. There was also a form of the disease that attacked the lungs and was transmitted through the air. And this one was even more lethal, as practically no one who contracted it survived. Inside their homes, families tried everything to protect themselves, guided by beliefs that mixed faith, superstition, and a rudimentary medicine based on the theory of the four humors inherited from the ancient Greeks. The prevailing belief was that the plague spread through polluted air, what doctors of the time called pestilent or poisonous air. It was believed that foul odors carried the disease and that pleasant aromas could ward off evil. Therefore, burning herbs indoors became a common practice. Rosemary, bay leaf, lavender, and juniper were placed in clay braziers and burned throughout the day, filling the rooms with a thick, fragrant smoke. Branches of fresh herbs were hung on doors and windows. Some residents spread vinegar in the corners of the house, believing that its strong smell neutralized the contaminated air. The diet inside homes also changed. In normal times, the diet of the poorest Londoners consisted mainly of dark bread made from barley oatmeal porridge, vegetables such as peas and turnips, and occasionally a piece of salted meat or dried fish. Weak beer was the most consumed beverage, even by children, as London's water was often unfit for consumption. With the arrival of the plague, the city's food supply collapsed. Peasants who supplied food to urban markets were dying or fleeing their villages. Livestock wandered abandoned through the fields, and crops rotted without anyone to gather them. The summer of 1348 had already been unusually rainy, compromising the harvest even before the disease spread. Inside homes, food reserves dwindled and hunger began to compound the fear of the plague. Women, who traditionally cared for the home and family, faced a brutal burden during this period. They prepared herbal infusions, kept the braziers burning, cooked with whatever was available, and cared for the sick. When a family member fell ill, there was nowhere to take them. Medieval hospitals were rare and precarious, geared more towards pilgrims and the elderly than to those with contagious diseases. Inside their homes, families provided care for their own sick members, even aware that this meant putting their own lives at risk. Mothers washed feverish bodies with cloths soaked in vinegar and rose water. They covered the sick with linen sheets when they had them and prepared thin broths in the hope of maintaining some relief. Home remedies included poultices made with onion, cooked, and butter applied to the swellings, in an attempt to drain what was believed to be the poison of the diseases. Religious devotion was the greatest refuge. In every home, even the humblest, there was at least one wooden crucifix or a small image of a saint. Families prayed together several times a day, imploring divine mercy. Many believed that the plague was a punishment from God for the sins of humanity, and acts of penance became common. Some dedicated themselves to uninterrupted prayers, others fasted, and many made promises to patron saints in the hope of being spared. But perhaps the most distressing aspect of life within those homes was the isolation. When someone in a household was identified as carrying the disease, the neighbors would distance themselves. Markings appeared on their doors, and families were confined, frequently without access to any outside help. Those who were healthy inside the house found themselves trapped with the sick, hearing the groans of those in agony, unable to leave or seek help. Under these conditions, it was common for all members of a family to fall ill and die one after the other, within days. Chroniclers of the time recorded scenes of entire houses found with all their inhabitants lifeless, without anyone having noticed. The wealthier tried a different strategy: escape. Families of merchants and nobles abandoned their homes in London and left for country estates, hoping to escape the city's polluted air. But many carried the disease with them, spreading it to areas that were still free from contamination. Those who could not flee locked their doors and sealed their windows, trying to create a barrier between the inside of the house and the devastated outside world. Children were the least able to understand what was happening, but they were deeply affected. Historical records indicate that babies and the elderly were the most vulnerable. Children watched their parents and siblings fall ill, and many were orphaned within weeks. The community ties that normally supported the helpless crumbled in the face of widespread fear. When someone died at home, the body had to be removed. At the beginning of the epidemic, attempts were made to provide dignified burials in parish cemeteries. But as deaths multiplied, cemeteries quickly filled up. Two large emergency burial grounds were created in London. One was in West Smithfield, near the present-day Charterhouse Square, and was authorized by a nobleman connected to King Edward I. The other was in East Smithfield, next to the Tower of London. Even in these emergency locations, burials were organized and methodical, with bodies arranged in orderly rows, demonstrating an attempt to maintain dignity in the face of chaos. But the death toll was so overwhelming that between February and April 1349, more than 200 bodies were buried per day in Smithfield alone. And that doesn't include burials in other cemeteries throughout the city. The clothing of Londoners at that time also tells part of this story. The poorest wore simple tunics, of course, wool dyed in dark shades with natural dyes, trousers of rustic fabric, and worn leather shoes. Women wore long dresses with a veil or cap covering their hair. When the plague took hold, many began to avoid the clothes of the dead, fearing that the fabric might carry the disease, a suspicion which was, to some extent, not entirely incorrect, as fleas could find refuge within the fibers of the cloth. Some medical treatises of the time recommended that clothes be aired and perfumed with spices to ward off contagion. Domestic animals were also part of the scene inside homes. Dogs and cats lived alongside families, and, ironically, cats, being natural rat hunters, could have helped contain the spread of the disease. However, in some regions of Europe, cats were associated with witchcraft and superstition, and many were exterminated, which may have aggravated the rodent infestation. Chickens were kept in backyards, or even inside the humblest homes, being one of the few accessible sources of protein. Pigs also roamed freely through the city's alleys, feeding on leftover garbage, contributing to the unsanitary conditions that favored the proliferation of the plague. Communication between confined families and the outside world was practically non-existent. There were no newspapers, no postal system accessible to the common people. News circulated by word of mouth, among the few who still risked venturing into the streets, by priests who went from house to house administering the last rites, or by cart drivers who collected the bodies. Each knock on the door could mean news of the death of a loved one or the arrival of another wave of panic. The churches, which normally served as meeting points and centers of information for the community emptied as the clergy also succumbed to the disease. It is estimated that about 2/3 of the English clergy died during the epidemic, leaving many parishes without a priest and many families without the spiritual comfort they so desperately sought. The notion of time within those homes also changed. Without the usual rhythm of work in the workshops, the weekly markets, and religious services, the days dragged on in an agonizing monotony, punctuated only by moments of prayer and constant fear. The nights were particularly terrible. In the darkness illuminated only by the flickering flame of a tallow candle or the almost extinguished embers of the fireplace, the sounds of the sick city became more audible. The creaking of carts carrying the dead passing through the streets, distant laments, the lonely barking of dogs that had lost their owners. The silence that gripped London in those months was recorded by several chroniclers. The workshops closed, the markets emptied. The church bells that once marked the hours of the day now tolled incessantly for the dead, until in some neighborhoods there was no one left to ring them. A monk named Henry of Knighton recorded that many towns and villages were completely deserted and that no one remained in the houses, for the people who once inhabited them were dead. In Westminster, a religious figure named John of Reading described that period as a time of death without mourning, marriage without affection, imposed penance, want without poverty, and flight without escape. When the epidemic finally began to subside around the end of 1349, London was transformed. It is estimated that around 35,000 people died in the city, more than half its population. Empty houses multiplied along the streets. The survivors inherited an unrecognizable world. In the following years, wages rose due to the labor shortage. Many workers were able to move into larger homes in the emptied city, and families began investing more in real estate, clothing, and food. Londoners' relationship with their homes would never be the same again. But none of this erased the memory of those terrible months, when each house was simultaneously a shelter and a trap, when the simple act of breathing was a source of terror, when a family could be gathered around the fire in the morning and, by nightfall, have already lost one of their own forever. Black Death not only decimated bodies, it forever reshaped how Londoners understood the fragility of life, the importance of home, and the unbearable price of fear. This was another dive into the past with the Reconstruction of the Past channel. If this story touched you in any way, share this video with someone who is also fascinated by history. See you in the next documentary.